No matter where you live, odds are you have a local urban legend. Today's video is part 1 of 5 covering each state in the United States and some of the scariest legends I could find. If you live in or have visited any of the 10 states I go through in this video, drop a comment if you have visited the place I cover and what your experience was like. Let's get started. Between a church and Maple Hill Cemetery in Huntsville, Alabama, lies an open space known as Maple Hill Park. The playground in particular in this park has become notorious for paranormal sightings and experiences and has been dubiously dubbed the Dead Children's Playground. As the legend goes, late at night the spirits of dead children will arise from their final resting place in the cemetery and congregate in the playground. People have reported sounds like voices of children laughing and playing in what seems to be the footsteps of them running and chasing each other. There are reports of seeing ghostly orbs and witnessing the swings of the swing set move on their own. Huntsville was hit particularly hard in the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, and the legend states that hundreds of children were all buried in Maple Hill Cemetery in a very short period of time due to the ravaging effect of the flu on the community's population. The prominent theory as to why these children's spirits haven't moved on into the afterlife states that since the time between infection and death was so short that the children are not even aware of the fact that they're dead. Sadly, it seems that the spirits congregating in Dead Children's Playground are doomed to repeat what they did in life forever. The Tlingit are an indigenous tribe of people that have lived on the coast of southwestern Alaska and parts of Canada for an estimated 10,000 years. They have a legend that states that when you're hunting in the woods and become lost or injured, that a group of normal-seeming men will approach you and then trick you into following them deeper into the woods. They may also lure their victims deeper into the woods by making sounds that sound like women and children in distress. The legend states that if you are approached by them or even hear them, then you're forever doomed and will never escape. They will lead you further and further away into the wilderness and eventually ambush you and tear you into pieces or somehow transform you into one of their own. The Kushtaka, as they call them, can best be described as otter-human hybrids that are capable of shape-shifting between a human form and a beast form. Their preferred victims seem to be small children, and they also kidnap babies. The Tlingit people are famous for keeping dogs and believe that they can sense these creatures and ward them off, claiming that the Kushtaka are terrified of them. They also seem to fear fire. They use this legend as a way to scare children from wandering too far from the villages and the oversight of their parents, but if you're in the region and you find yourself lost in the woods, you should definitely beware of the Kushtaka shapeshifters. The gruesome legend states that during Arizona's gold rush in the 1800s, a father left his cabin in search of gold and food and failed to return to his home in Slaughterhouse Canyon where his wife and children were waiting for him. Eventually, as the days became weeks, they began to starve to death. The children, being much more fragile than the mother, would first complain that they were hungry, and then they would eventually start going through the long and agonizing process of starving. On top of all of that, the wife was now grief-stricken at the suspected loss of her husband, and the process of her own starvation mixed with that grief would start to turn into insanity. Unable to come up with a solution, she would lock the children in the cabin and try to go outside to ease her mind, but she would never find comfort. She lacked the energy to go very far away, and the screams and wailing of her tormented children dying nearby would echo loudly off the canyon walls no matter where she went. It soon became clear that there was no escape. With each cry of pain, her insanity would increase, and eventually it took complete control over her. She would then return inside the cabin and brutally murder her children before committing suicide. Visitors to the area today say they can still feel a sense of overwhelming sadness that lingers in the canyon, and it's been reported that you can still sometimes hear the screams of her children and their tormented mother crying out for forgiveness for her twisted deeds. In one of Arkansas's oldest communities, Quitman, lies a home known as the Bettis house. Floyd and Aline Bettis moved into the home in 1950 and eventually, after struggling for a long while, were able to finally have their one and only child, Gerald, in 1954. But Gerald would quickly gain the reputation as a vicious and cruel brat. This saddened the people who knew his parents, as everyone in the town seemed to think that they were great people. The older Gerald got, however, the more vicious he would become. Eventually, around the age of 10, he began to collect stray dogs and cats and then torture and kill them. The townsfolk would often report hearing horrific howling and crying, and they would know that Gerald was somewhere out there taking the life of another animal. He enjoyed this hobby so much that he began to hoard the animals and lock them up as he got older, eventually going so far as to adding on an addition to his parents' home to keep them all. It is widely suspected that in addition to torturing and killing these animals, he would also perform cruel and unusual experiments on them. He was also often abusive of his parents and even threw his father out of a window in his teen years. As an adult, Gerald was an awkward and creepy man who stood 6'4" and weighed nearly 300 pounds. As his parents grew older and weaker, he then imprisoned them in their house and was said to feed them only when he deemed that they deserved the food. Most of the people were afraid of Gerald, and one of his neighbors even said that his eyes had a creepy glow. According to official reports, Floyd Bettis died in 1981 of an illness at home, but the rumor was that there was evidence that Gerald had thrown him down a flight of stairs, and that was his true cause of death. In the early 1980s, Aline fell and broke her hip and required a trip to the hospital. While there, a retired nurse witnessed Gerald slapping his mother and threatening her. Immediately after, Aline was placed in adult protective services and removed from the home permanently. Gerald would later be arrested for his treatment of his mother and his involvement in selling drugs. Not long after his conviction, he then died in prison. To this day, people report seeing a large werewolf-like creature with glowing eyes stalking the home. There are also still reports of a strange howling sound coming from somewhere in the night, as if something is being tortured or killed. In California's Santa Lucia mountain range, people frequently report being stared at by a group of mysterious and featureless dark silhouettes while hiking the trails just before dark. The shadow figures are often said to be wearing brimmed hats and have walking sticks with them. Many reports state that they are unnaturally tall, with some estimates ranging between 10 and 12 feet. These dark watchers have been reported in the area since the 1700s, and as Anglo-American settlers began staking claims in the region, they too felt that they were being watched from the hills. When people have attempted to approach the odd figures, they are said to vanish without a trace. Although a few scientific theories attempt to rationalize these experiences, there are many people who swear they are real, and some even set out offerings to them like fruit, flowers, and other gifts. They became infamous when John Steinbeck immortalized them by mentioning them in his novel Flight. The passage reads, "He saw a black figure for a moment, but he looked quickly away, for it was one of the Dark Watchers. No one knew who the Watchers were, nor where they lived, but it was better to ignore them and never to show interest in them. They did not bother one who stayed on the trail and minded his own business." To this day, when hiking in the region near dawn and dusk, many people see these mysterious specters. Before its time as a place of leisure and recreation, Cheesman Park in Denver, Colorado was known as Mount Prospect Cemetery. It opened its gates in 1859 and quickly became one of Denver's largest cemeteries, and served as the not-so-final resting place for more than 5,000 people. Less than 30 years later, however, the booming town considered the cemetery to be an eyesore and figured it would be better served as a park. So Denver took up the task of relocating the graves and corpses to various other locations. To speed up these efforts, the local government hired a man by the name of E.P. McGovern and offered to pay him for every coffin he moved. McGovern, in an effort to make as much money as quickly as possible, began exhuming a large amount of corpses and, unbeknownst to his employers, began dismembering untold numbers of them and mixing and matching the remains into other coffins. Eventually, the cemetery became so littered with open graves, coffins, and dismembered bodies that the Denver officials caught wind of what was happening there and immediately fired McGovern. The officials then decided that it was for the best if they just reburied the corpses, coffins, and body parts, removed the headstones, and then declared their work to be done, leaving an estimated 3,000 bodies still in the ground. To this day, there are reports of confused and sad-looking ghostly people knocking on nearby houses' doors, ghostly children who are seen playing and then disappear, and a famous woman who is singing to herself as she passes you, but when you look over your shoulder, she's no longer there. People who lie on the grass in the park have reported feeling as though it was hard to stand up, as if some unseen force was holding them or even pulling them into the ground. And on moonlit nights, some say you can still see the outlines of headstones. Described by those who knew her as a difficult shrew of a woman, Hannah Cranna became known as the Wicked Witch of Monroe. Born in 1783, not much is known about her life until she married Captain Joseph Hovey. They would have no children, and eventually the rumors would start to swirl that Hannah was a witch. She became infamous for demanding one-sided favors from her neighbors, and if they didn't follow through on these requests, bad things would happen to them. These rumors only intensified when her husband would go out on a stroll late one evening and mysteriously fall off the side of the cliff to his death. He was very familiar with the area, as he had walked and explored it many times before, so when the news came of his accident, this struck all who knew him as odd. People would then say that Hannah had bewitched and confused him to cause the death. She would never remarry and instead opted to live on the property alone with her chickens, with some even claiming that her property was guarded by snakes. Her husband's untimely death would leave Hannah in poverty, and she was not above using her reputation as a witch to extort food and firewood from her neighbors, who would then fear her taking retribution on them if they failed to comply. Eventually, her rooster, whom many considered to be her familiar, would die. She would then approach a neighbor and tell them that she too would soon pass away. She demanded that the townsfolk would carry her coffin to the cemetery by hand instead of using a cart, and that she was not allowed to be buried before the sun had set. Sure enough, shortly thereafter, she did pass away. Ignoring her final wishes, the neighbors tried to place her coffin on a sled as the ground was covered in snow, but after numerous attempts, her coffin would inexplicably slide off and the sled would refuse to move under the weight. Eventually, they had no choice but to carry her coffin to the cemetery by hand, and since it had taken so long for them to arrive, the sun had already set. Once the burial was complete, the townspeople returned to the town to find her home was engulfed in flames. This served to validate the suspicion surrounding Hannah and her use of witchcraft. Her gravestone can be found in Gregory's Four Corners burial ground in today's Trumbull, Connecticut, which is right next to Monroe. To this day, people have reported hearing a faint and evil-sounding woman cackling on occasion, and they say once in a while a spectral figure will appear in the graveyard and cause cars traveling down the nearby road to crash. In Cape Henlopen State Park, a mysterious phantom light is said to mimic a lighthouse, even though there is no lighthouse on the Cape. People often report seeing flashing and pulsing lights on the Cape of inexplicable origin. Allegedly, the light comes from a curse that native people placed on the area after British troops stormed a wedding ceremony and brutally massacred an unknown number of guests. The legend states that the native curse called for the destruction of any European ships who encroached on the shores. On Christmas Day in 1665, a ship called the Devonshire was following the light of what they thought was a lighthouse and crashed into a shaft of stone jutting out from the seafloor. It sank the ship and more than 200 men died in the cold winter water as a result. Many have reported sightings of a ghost ship in the nearby waters where it is said that it is cursed to repeat its final moments before its doom forever. Count Carl von Cosel worked as a civilian X-ray technician in the U.S. Marine Hospital in Key West during the Great Depression. Cosel's real name was Karl Tanzler, but insisted that people call him Count von Cosel. He often stated that he had numerous university degrees and that he had been a submarine captain, but all of this was fabricated by Tanzler. While working in the hospital, he would have a fateful meeting with a 22-year-old terminal tuberculosis patient by the name of Elena. Cosell instantly fell in love and made various attempts to convince Elena to court him. He even went so far as to claim that he could cure her tuberculosis with a process using an X-ray machine, water tonics, and gold. Skeptical but desperate, Elena agreed to let him try, and when they failed to work, she died. Carl then contacted her family in Cuba and got their approval to move her to a stone mausoleum nearby. They agreed, and he did just that. Since Elena had died in poverty, she had not been embalmed and began to rapidly decay. Before placing her corpse in the mausoleum, however, Carl would hire a mortician to clean her body. Carl then secretly kept the key to her crypt. Carl would frequently come back and visit her corpse, bringing her gifts, flowers, and eventually go so far as to install a telephone, claiming that he could communicate with Elena through voice and song. After more than 2 years of doing this, Carl would then abscond with her remains and took them back to his home. There he would dress her in a wedding dress, preserve her body with chemicals and oils, and would mask the smell of decomposition with perfume. He would even go so far as to use mortician's wax to restore her facial features. His neighbors began to become suspicious of him as they knew he was single and lived alone, but he was spotted multiple times in public buying perfume, women's clothing, and would even be seen to be dancing with what they thought was a large doll through his windows at night. Elena's sister Nana heard about all of this and would eventually confront Carl. He would then admit to Nana what he had done and show her Elena's corpse, which was dressed in a wedding dress and propped up in a chair. Nana was horrified and went to the police, who then arrested and put Carl on trial. During his court proceedings, he would insist that if he could use an airship, he could fly Elena's body to the stratosphere and that the radiation would resurrect her. Obviously, he was easily convicted of his crimes, but by the time the trial had reached its conclusion, the statute of limitations had expired and no sentencing could be given. The judge would become furious with Carl at the end of the trial when he asked for Elena's body back. For a short while after this, Carl would then charge tourists 25 cents each to tour his home, which he called his home laboratory, and when they stopped showing up, he would then use dynamite to blow up Elena's old crypt and leave town. In 1952, Carl Tanzler, aka Count Carl von Cosell, was found dead clutching a life-size doll, and it would later be discovered that Tanzler had secretly made a death mask of Elena's face and installed it onto the doll. Although all of this is true, legend states that you can still hear a telephone ringing in the cemetery where her crypt once stood. In addition, there are reports that a shadowy figure can be seen wandering around the cemetery looking into crypts, and that a ghostly visage of a woman in a wedding dress can be seen running through the cemetery as if trying to escape someone who is pursuing her. In 1946, Georgia government officials got congressional approval to make Lake Lanier. They then bought out entire towns and began the process of making the lake. Rather than demolish the towns, they elected to just flood them over and let the water cover them up. At the bottom of Lake Lanier lies nearly fully intact towns, ferries, and a racetrack. There are also an estimated 20 cemeteries. Many claim that this has cursed the lake and gave it an eerie feel. Divers frequently film videos of creepy sights and events at the bottom of the lake. They also frequently report feeling as though they had touched or were touched by legs and arms in the water, only to not be able to find anything when they investigate further. These claims are also corroborated by swimmers. In addition, Lake Lanier is also haunted by the large number of deaths and boating accidents that take place in its waters. Recently, in a period of 20 years, the lake recorded over 200 drowning deaths and many more boating-related accidents resulting in deaths and injuries. Today, people still claim to see ghostly figures wandering on the shore, odd groups of bubbles surfacing as though someone or something large is swimming beneath its waters, and frequent flash sightings of faces, arms, and legs in the water. This concludes part 1. If you watched the entire video, thank you. It really helps the channel get more views and it helps me grow the community. As always, if you enjoyed the video, remember to click the like button, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing and clicking the bell to get notified when the next video goes live. Until next time, stay weird, everybody.